Good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Kara Neely and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. We have a loop hearing section at each program designated by a sign, as well as a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Senior Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard. Dr. Barbara Ballard,
Hello, we have a new student assistant today. Thank you very much, Kara. I will say good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for the fourth and final program of the 2020 Presidential Lecture Series. I would personally like to add, we are very appreciative that you have decided to attend this series. If it's your first one, I'm sure you will enjoy it. If this is your fourth one, you know just how good it's going to be this evening. Tonight's guest is Professor of Communication, Denise Bostdorff. This year's Presidential Lecture Series was created and developed by Dr. Robert Rowland. We would like to thank Dr. Rowland for putting together an engaging series of programs. And I think you know what I mean when I say engaging. You always have that opportunity to ask questions after we finish. So if you didn't hear what you wanted to hear or you wanted to comment on it, you have that opportunity. And we thank Dr. Rowland so much for that. We would also like to thank our co-sponsors, the University of Kansas Department of Communication Studies, the Department of History, and the Department of Political Science. This evening's interview will be conducted by Dole Institute Associate Director Audrey Coleman. Dr. Bostdorff is Professor and Chair of Communication Studies at the College of Wooster. She is the recipient of the Bruce E. Gronbeck Political Communication Research Award. Her areas of research include presidential rhetoric about race, foreign policy, political campaigns, and war. That's a lot to talk about. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Bostdorff. So ladies and gentlemen, please give her a very warm Jayhawk welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Bostdorff, it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight.
Thank you
for being here.
It's lovely to be here too.
Would you start by telling us a little bit about what some of the key moments in presidential rhetoric, what are some of the key moments in history over the last few decades?
Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting in terms of how presidential rhetoric, has changed is I think that there's really been a move toward the visual. And on the one hand, one might look to John Kennedy and say, well, he was the first president that had televised press conferences, and he was very good in that, and he was. But the president that I would really speak to as perfecting that visual communication would be Ronald Reagan. He understood how to use the visual communication to reinforce his verbal communication. When he did his inaugural address, he switched the location of the inaugural from the east side of the Capitol to the west side. And the reason he did that was because he wanted to refer to the various monuments as he talked. And by moving to the west side, when he would talk about the Washington Monument, the cameras for the TV news would pan to the Washington Monument. They would talk about Jefferson Memorial. They moved to the Jefferson Memorial. So at a time when he was really trying to emphasize American values and a regeneration of confidence, he was using the visual to reinforce the verbal. And that continued throughout his presidency, and I think it kind of set a trend for presidents that followed, that they had to pay a little bit more attention to what they were wearing, the lighting, what the location would be, that type of thing. And even now, if you think about social media, a lot of the things that we see on social media are visual. There are photographs that are turned into memes sometimes. Sometimes a simple photograph that is shared. I think about, in the last year or so, a picture that's been circulating and now recirculating of President Trump talking to government officials about the future of women's health. And nothing needs to be said that the fact that there are no women around the table, right? And so the visual really serves to convey a particular image, not always in keeping with what the president might want, but those who are very adept at it have used it to their advantage, right? A couple of other trends, you just have to interrupt me and go, oh, stop. Another thing I think that we've really seen is a focus on, I would say, what's ceremonial rhetoric. And Robin would laugh because this is something I'm very interested in, is ceremonial rhetoric. But we do see an increase in that. So what is that? A lot of us would think about ceremonial rhetoric. You'd be absolutely right. Graduation commencement addresses, anniversaries, commemorations, eulogies at funerals, and those types of things. And while those have always been present in contemporary presidential rhetoric, they've really increased, starting with Ronald Reagan. Rod Hart, who is a scholar down at the University of Texas, did a study once just simply counting the numbers of ceremonial speeches that took place, and he found that the presidents Kennedy through Reagan appeared in ceremonial settings almost twice as often as Truman and Eisenhower did. And I think that trend really has escalated. Now, Ronald Reagan did that a lot because I think after the ravages of Vietnam and Watergate, he was trying to restore confidence in the country, so it made sense that he would have a lot of ceremonial rhetoric. And Aristotle would talk about ceremonial rhetoric as being praising values the audience already believes in, or condemning values that the audience already opposes. Now, you might look at that and say, that's fluff. Why should we pay attention to that? And in fact, a lot of times we tend to write it off as not being that important. But those types of speeches can reinforce our allegiance to particular values of the country or to particular takes on certain values, right? And what I've noticed is that we have a lot more ceremonial speaking. I think Ronald Reagan sometimes used it, as other presidents had, George W. Bush during Iraq, to deflect attention, right? If you have something that is going on where people are asking uncomfortable questions, having a ceremonial speech is great because you cordon the press off in the back. And if they ask questions, why, it's very rude to interrupt somebody in the middle of a ceremony, right, to ask those difficult questions. So that can happen too. There's also a benefit for any president who engages in that kind of rhetoric, because if you're praising values the audience already believes in, then you kind of bask in the glow, right, the reflection of those sorts of values. I think, too, that we as a country turn to our presidents more often for the ceremonial messages of assurance. If you think about Bill Clinton with the Oklahoma City bombing, Ronald Reagan with the Space Shuttle Challenger, we think about how many mass shootings that Barack Obama had to speak about in public. And so there's really kind of an expectation now that presidents will speak on those occasions. And the other thing which I think is really interesting, and I want to do something with, but one of those projects that kind of by my back burner, but I noticed that presidents increasingly went to more commencement speeches until our most recent president. But Bill Clinton and George W. Bush escalated the number of commencement speeches, in particular at military academies. And I think it's really interesting. They set the tone that now when a president is in office, and President Trump has done this as well, you have to give a commencement address at least one military academy in the spring. And isn't it interesting that Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, who both had questions raised about either escaping service or escaping service in Vietnam itself, were the two who really used that venue to kind of assume the military role of commander-in-chief, right? So it's very interesting to me that.
Fascinating. So you talked a little bit about how the visual elements have made presidential speeches more complex in that way. In the first series, in the first installment of this series, we talked a little bit about how the electorate has diversified, or like the expectation that the president will address a diverse electorate has changed. You know, that's an expectation now, whereas in the past it was sort of a white, male,
Right.
Christian audience. How can you comment a little bit on how messaging has changed over the decades in that way?
Well, I think one of the things that you see, and this kind of connects to the visual, I'll just use the State of the Union as an example of this, is that I keep using Ronald Reagan, but there are a lot of trends that began with him. Ronald Reagan started what we now know as the person in the gallery at the State of the Union address. All right? So when the president will point to someone in the gallery and say, this person did X, Y, or Z, right? And we all applaud for that person. I was kind of interested in that at the time that Ronald Reagan did that, because I studied presidential crisis rhetoric. And Grenada, we had invaded in Grenada, which was not popular among Democratic representatives. And what he did was he said, and over here is Lieutenant Trujillo. He saved his fellow soldiers under enemy fire. And of course, everyone, Republicans and Democrats, got up and applauded. And he said something to the effect of, and now we know that our policy in Grenada was the right thing to do, right? And they're going, wait a minute, what just happened, right? So that's also an interesting example of how little ceremonials can be used for subversive purposes. But what you started to see is that at that address, they would have a variety of different kinds of people that would be represented amongst those heroes. So if you notice that President Trump, for example, who has often gotten criticism about his say lack of diversity sometimes, or insensitivity to diversity in his public comments, that he had a lot of African Americans amongst the people that he pointed out. And so I think that is also one way in which that presidents have tried to address that visually.
In 2017, you wrote an article on the rhetoric of political change. What are some of the attributes of presidential speech related to change?
Well, I think one of the things that ends up happening is that at certain points, if things aren't going particularly well, right, it's much easier for a candidate to come along, especially if they're an outsider, in the sense that they're not somebody, you're not running for re-election, let's put it that way. You're not somebody who's been in the Senate forever and ever, to come and say, I will bring that change, right? So you see that with both Barack Obama and with Donald Trump. One of the traps of that change rhetoric, though, is that in order to make themselves appear to be the hero who's going to really institute all of this change, they have to raise expectations really, really high. And it's incredibly difficult to fulfill those expectations completely, right? Presidents have a lot of power, but they don't have endless power. And sometimes there are things that happen, the economy, foreign policy crisis, something of that nature that a president may not see coming or may not have all that much control over. And the other part about it is that, they can say a lot of things. I'm going to do all these things, but you may not get all those things done. And so then there's great disappointment. You said, with Barack Obama, you were going to be the president of hope and change, and yet you didn't do all of these things. In President Trump's case, I think when he was running for office, he really capitalized on anger. One of the things that we know, there have been a number of studies done that show that people who supported Trump were far more likely to feel anger. And it's kind of hard to know what comes first, the chicken or the egg. There's disaffection there perhaps already. Some research seems to indicate some economic, because of dislocation with, the industrial sector, right? I'm from Ohio, so we've got a lot of places like Youngstown, Ohio, that have really been devastated, long before Donald Trump was running for office, but it continues. The steel industry was pretty much wiped out, and now they're struggling with the auto industry and related, areas. But also, we've got demographic changes that you alluded to, right? So as we become more diverse, sometimes there's a blowback of people who, are from the majority feeling like, wait a minute, this isn't the America I know, and I feel like this isn't quite right. And so through his rhetoric, I think he's able to capitalize on the stirring up, anger. We know from research that anger is really motivating. Sometimes I would hear people say that he appealed to fear, but actually I think he appealed to anger far more, because anger is a motivating factor. And so I think that you see that a lot of times with the rhetoric of change.
Mm-hmm. And how else what other tropes have you observed in either our current president or President Obama, and how would you compare and contrast those?
Oh, boy. There are a lot of differences, I guess. One thing, you met some of the changes, social media, right? So we had television and we had a focus on the visual, and that has continued through with social media. And maybe if I could just back up a little bit,
Sure.
Just to talk about changes in the media themselves, which have really changed presidential rhetoric and how we intersect with it. So to begin with, in the 1980s, broadcast media, radio and television, were deregulated. And what that meant was that the people in charge were a little bit more at liberty to say, okay, we want you to do X, Y, or Z, and not fulfill necessarily the public service component of broadcast, TV and radio news. And they were also then told, you have to compete. I know you're the news division at CBS and you have a long, storied history, but you have to compete with the entertainment division now to get viewership. So think for just a little moment about what that means if you're just trying to get viewership, right? And also, if you want to get resources, you have to get viewership. So it's kind of a dog chasing its tail a little bit, but if you don't have quite as many resources, you go for easier stories. And when you go for easier stories, it keeps you from covering things that are more complex. And so what you see, I think, is television news that tended to cover then things that were more dramatic, a few more fluff stories, the human interest story type of thing, just to get viewership. Then in 1980, CNN comes along, and we have the 24-hour news cycle. And that changes things too, because it means if you're a politician, you have got to find ways to, they always say, this kind of crass, to feed the media. Well, in a sense, that's true. You have to find messages that you can send out to journalists to fill those 24 hours, because if you don't, others will be more than happy to fill the vacuum by putting in things that are negative, perhaps, about what you are trying to do. So that can be problematic as well. Then, 1996, I guess, we get Fox News and we get MSNBC. And now there's even more competition, right? We've got broadcast, we've got all these cable, and these are just the news, and they're all competing with each other to try to get attention. You add the internet to that, and people have lots and lots of choices about what they're going to watch. We were talking earlier today with a couple of people about some of these changes, and it used to be, and I know some of you can relate to this, when you were a child growing up, there were 3 networks. I grew up on a farm in Northwest Ohio. We had 2 TV stations, and then we moved around the corner and got 3, and it was like, woohoo, right? But if you were watching television and the president was giving a speech, that's what you would watch that night, because that's what was on. But now, you don't have to, because one, the speech may or may not be covered, and you can watch sports, you could stay on the internet, look at other things. So we're not all seeing the same things. And it is also the case that a lot of times people are not watching an entire speech, right? How many of you watched, I'm just curious, the entire State of the Union address? Okay? And this is out of a group of people who are really more interested, I'm guessing, in politics than the average person, right? And still not that many of you watched all of it. And so what that means is that we're learning about what presidents say more through media coverage and social media coverage. And that means that those little sound bites or those little visual bites together on social media are what we sometimes know about what a president has said. Sound bites have decreased, I think in 1968 it was 43 seconds, and now it's down, I think, to about 8.5 was the last thing that I heard. That's barely anything, right? So that makes it very difficult. If you are a president or would-be presidential contender, you have to try to be brief, but yet articulate a compelling argument, and hopefully have some visuals that help support it. That's a lot to try to do. And so to go back to your question then about Barack Obama and Donald Trump, it's interesting in many ways because Barack Obama did more than perhaps any other president to bring the internet into the White House. Bill Clinton had the first website, but the first live tweeted speech was Barack Obama. They had the first Twitter account for the White House, Barack Obama. The first Facebook, Barack Obama. And he had a great social media team, and they used that all very skillfully. But now we have a president who goes around the media by directly tweeting all the time. Now, sometimes you would have President Obama, would send out, but most of the time it was his staff doing it. With the current president, most of the time it's him, right? You can tell that he's got his Twitter in particular sort of fits the mood of the people that he's especially speaks to, I think. Twitter is very short. You only have 280 characters. I mean, you can send out subsequent tweets, which he certainly does, but he still doesn't get that long, right? There have been some folks, scholars who do reading level studies, and what they found was that of the last 15 presidents, President Trump has the lowest reading level of his public messages. In other words, when he sends out messages to the public in general, and this includes just his regular speeches, he's at about the 4th grade reading level, all right? As opposed to Barack Obama, who is at midway through 9th grade, close to 10th grade reading level. We had 2 others that were higher than that. The 2 engineers, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, were at the 11th grade level. But one wonders, I guess I would say, is that did Barack Obama in the current environment, was it harder for him sometimes to reach a broader audience, perhaps, because he spoke at a higher level than what he did? I don't know, but that's just something that I wonder about a little bit. But with Twitter, because it's very short, the short sentences, the simple phrasing, it works very well for that. And Twitter, one of the things we know from research is that it's interesting about social media. Now on Twitter and Facebook and so on, you can use your phone or you can use a computer, right, to go through it. And what they find is that when people use their phone, they are more likely to engage in incivility, all right? And so it's not surprising in some ways that perhaps because he's using his phone to send these out, it would kind of correspond with that. But it reflects that anger, I think, as well there, which is different.
So we have kind of two channels going on,
Yeah.
a formal speech channel and a running Twitter. How are those related, or how does Donald Trump use those two together?
Right. His formal speeches are kind of interesting because he doesn't feel as comfortable in that form, and he certainly has had people who work with him on his, and also all presidents do, speechwriters who are helping him. He's a little more close to the vest about who is helping him because, he doesn't want to, I guess, to let people know who it is who might be helping to write speeches. Steve Bannon has been involved in the past. It looks like Stephen Miller has been involved, but we don't know, everyone. But sometimes what he does that's kind of interesting is that he sometimes reinforces what he says in these formal speeches, but then sometimes he undercuts it. And this is not just about him, but it's the fragmentary nature of where we are with social media, is that it can be very difficult for people to pay attention to what's going on here and something different is said over here. And if you don't hear all of those messages together, you may not necessarily know that they are not compatible. So in his State of the Union address, for example, he said, "I will never touch your Social Security, I will never cut your Medicare," and yet in another speech, just in comments at Davos, earlier, to people, wealthy people who gather for this, kind of discussion of the world economy and so on, he said, I'm thinking about cutting entitlements." And then a little bit later, his budget comes out, and he said, and they're cutting, he wants to cut Social Security and wants to cut, Medicare. So sometimes the different messages are not necessarily compatible, but part of the problem is that who's paying attention to all the different, running pieces. And I think some of this also goes back to some other changes in media, actually, which are that because of all the competition that's happened, because of deregulation, because of all the cable, because of the social media, all that sort of thing, the media themselves have sometimes been their own worst enemy, because in their effort to try to be first to break a story, I think we can all think of different examples where they've been wrong. And so because of that, it undercuts their credibility. And then, President Trump has made, no bones about the fact that, with his charges of fake media and so on, and that undercuts it further. So what people tend to do is we tend to stay, and this is not any surprise to you, this is something that's talked about a lot, but we tend to stay within our tribes, right? And the algorithms of social media say, and again, 90% of eligible American voters are on Facebook, right? And it has the most sophisticated targeting and analytics. So if they know that you like this message, well, then a similar kind of message is going to be sent to you, later. And so that may mean that if you don't trust the print media, which, print media are struggling, right? And if you don't pay attention to other traditional media and you only see what's there, it can be problematic. One thing I will say, though, which is kind of the opposite of what we think, is even though cable news, networks in general, are getting more viewership and the networks are worried, it's interesting to note that network news programs, so like CBS, NBC's evening news, ABC's evening news, they still get far more viewership even today than what the most popular news program, which right now I think is still Hannity, on Fox News gets. Even the third place gets almost twice as much in terms of viewership. So I think sometimes we're thinking, oh, nobody well, they still have that, but the viewership is starting to dwindle, compared to what it once was.
And how do those numbers compare to Twitter users or Twitter followers?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I couldn't give you the exact numbers right off the top of my head. Twitter followers, what's interesting about it, Twitter gets used a lot by campaigns as a way to reach journalists, ironically, right? And you can see that, right? That's one of the things that President Trump was very smart about during the campaign. So he got a lot of free news coverage by tweeting out things. He still does, right? By tweeting out things, or by calling up. He would call up talk shows, and they would just let him riff, or they would show his, campaign rallies or that type of thing. But Twitter users are not representative of the American electorate as a whole. Twitter users tend to be younger. The average age is about 40. They tend to be more male than female, and they tend to be more ideological.
How has our understanding of fact and authenticity changed with the rise of internet and social media?
Oh, well, it's changed, to say the least. Again, I guess the part about it that makes it very difficult is that because people, and again, to put it in perspective, even though we sometimes bemoan, oh, this is only a phenomenon that happens today, it's never happened before. Even in the 1950s, when they were doing, or late 1940s, even when they were doing public opinion surveys and research on this, they found that people tended to seek out political information from people whose partisan views were like theirs. So that part is not new. Right? That part's not new. And they tended to seek out sources that were more like their own views to begin with. But now I think everything is magnified a bit because we don't have some common set of messages that we look at, right? Or at least for a lot of people. And so what that means is that each side may automatically dismiss, oh, it's on Fox News, or oh, it's on MSNBC. Or that's the failing New York Times, that I've heard that phrase, picked up by other people. I'm not going to listen to what they have to say. So we dismiss it automatically, which has really undermined the sense of what is a fact, right? Sometimes we can't even agree on basic events that happened. But you mentioned authenticity, and to me that might be a little bit different, maybe. And I think that President Trump, conveys for people who support him great authenticity, because he certainly, and even people who don't agree with him, he certainly says what he thinks. So it's not the case that you would say, oh, he's putting up, what you see a lot of times overall seems to be, what he's thinking. The problem is the contradictions. And because of that fragmented nature, it's like, how does the center hold?
Mhm. You've used the phrase counterfactual advocacy. Could you explain to us what that is and how that has affected presidential rhetoric?
Well, that you have what this refers to, actually, my friend Steve Goldswick was the person who came up with that term, but he was just talking about the fact that online you have a lot of groups whose sole purpose, and it's not just online, but especially you see it there, but their main purpose is to advocate for things that are not true. Right? To try to convince people that something that did happen, didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way that they said it happened, or that this thing happened even though it didn't happen. And if this last election, certainly there were cases, we know now, from the FBI investigation and some other work, Kathleen Hall-Jameson at the Annenberg School of Communication and some other folks, that Russian bots did in fact have ads, especially on social media, that do seem to have influenced people's opinions on things. There was an instance, for example, down in Texas, where there was a controversy, I think it was about Black Lives Matter, and there's two different groups, and they were ready to confront each other at this big rally, and they sort of figured out that nobody knew who was organizing either event, because it had been organized solely online. And so that's kind of interesting, right? So that there is this manipulation that is going on, and it's pretty easy to do, really.
What can we do as what would you recommend to us as users and consumers of social media? Is there any counteracting this kind of negative rhetoric, or how do we perhaps regain control or create a constructive dialogue
It is
in
really,
this environment?
No, I mean, it's a really good question. I think one thing is simply to be willing to look at what, quote, the other side, whatever your other side is saying. When I go to the gym, I watch MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News are usually all on, especially Fox where I'm at will be on. And I like watching all of them. Sometimes it's like watching completely different universes. But it is useful to be able to see, okay, what are the other perspectives? Because sometimes it is, people are in agreement on an event, but they look at it from very different points of view. Some of it on social media is look carefully at first of all, who is this person who posted this thing, right? Originally, it might have been shared by a friend, and look also to see what the name of it actually is, because there are a lot of organizations out there that will change. So it'll be cbsnews.com. something weird, and it's something that's trying to pretend to be CBS News, but it really isn't. And so I think looking at those, sometimes going to that site and saying, okay, let's track it. So they seem to be citing an original story. Can I find that original story? Don't just take the headline at face value. Actually look to see what the rest of the story says, because again, they're trying to get you to click. Well, if you're going to like it, then at least look at it. Because a lot of times the headlines, and on both sides, are very deceiving. It'll make it appear as though someone has said something when they didn't really say it exactly. Maybe it was a question and answer session, and the other person asked them to make the comparison, and they said, well, I think I'd probably agree with that. Whereas this said, they said X. It's a little bit different than that. So those are some of the things. And look at the dates. There are things that recirculate. Sometimes something will be several years old, and suddenly it's showing up again. It's like, timing's interesting. Why is that showing up now? Could it be because people are trying to make it a trend again, so that you will get upset? Whenever you look at something, if it makes you angry, then I would say maybe you should look into that a little bit more, because that, on social media in particular, is what those who are trying to instill chaos are trying to do. They're trying to make you angry and appalled, and you want to make sure. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't reasons to be angry and appalled, but you want to make sure that it's based on things that really happened.
In today's soundbite-oriented world, what do you think is the future of the form of the presidential speech?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that presidential speeches will always be important, and even today, think about President Trump going to his campaign rallies. Those are still very significant for him in terms of a way of rallying his supporters. The State of the Union address is still something that we definitely expect. I mean, he's changed it in a number of different ways, this last time around, but it's something that we still expect. And speeches can also be very helpful in terms of getting a sense of the thinking and the larger reasoning behind policies. And those people who are the policymakers do pay attention to all those details. So I think it will still be important with regard to that. In terms of where it goes with social media, I don't know. I wish I did so I could tell you and I could say I was the first one to think of that. But I'm not really sure. We have now where you can get a link to go to a video, and sometimes speeches after the fact will have a lot of people who watch them, right? One speech, you mentioned President Obama earlier. One speech that I think is probably, for me at least, the best speech that he ever gave, a very sad occasion, but was his eulogy at Charleston for Reverend Clementa Pinckney. And that's interesting, is online, that speech still gets viewed a lot. So people are going back to look at it, right? And so it's interesting to see what's the short-term versus long-term impact of such things too, right?
In the first installment of this presidential lecture series, we asked a panel what were their favorite presidential speeches. Could you give us a couple of your favorites?
Well, that would be one. That one to me was, I think, it is so, you understand a lot about Barack Obama's presidency and the constraints on him as a president when you look at that speech and everything going on around it and his efforts to try to counter. So what do I mean by that? I think that when Barack Obama became president, there was a lot of ideas out there that this would be the end of racism, right? And he sometimes, he fed into that with the idea of hope and change, right? And he would talk about himself, his other speech, the very famous, A More Perfect Union, when he had ran into trouble because of his minister, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, where people were saying, hey, this is incendiary, are you associated with him? And he gave a speech on nationwide television that saved his candidacy, really. But there were all these pressures that, on the one hand, we're going to be in a post-racial society now. And the thing is that, of course, there are certain systems in place that make it hard. Racism is not just a matter of individual, attitude, but it's also, policies over long periods of time. I know even my little small town of Wooster, Ohio, where I'm at, there were definitely divisions even as, recently as 20 years ago. Black people could not live north of, a particular avenue. You had to stay in this other area. So things like that make a difference in terms of income and so on over time. And when Barack Obama was president, he also faced the other issue, which was then the African American communities, what are you doing for us? And he could never meet those expectations. And I think that this particular eulogy, what you saw was one, again, we talked about ceremonial rhetoric, and we turned to the president for assurance, and I think everybody in the country was turning to assurance after that, terrible, terrible event. But in that speech, he took the African American experience and he said, this is not some experience off the side. The African American experience is the American experience, right? Talking about progress. He kind of combined some, I would say, some elements of the black church and collective salvation. And I think the thing that probably you all remember the most maybe is when he started to sing Amazing Grace. And the idea of grace as being an open heart to recognize ourselves in the other person, to recognize our own failings, and to be willing to accept and go forward to act better, to try to be better, to perfect. That perfect thing shows up a lot in his rhetoric. So that would be one, I think, for me. I think, and again, Ronald Reagan, I think his D-Day ceremony where he was celebrating the 40th anniversary and they were in France. You see the visuals there very much. They planned that all out. I mean, they knew what the light would be like when he would be there, exactly where he was going to stand, how the veterans would be seated. And when he said, "We stand on this windswept point," you can see the windswept point behind him. When he's talking about, "These are the boys who scaled the cliffs." There they are, right? Here are the men, who accomplished this. So that is a pretty memorable one. And I also think to John Kennedy, like his American University address, where this is the person who is in office during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we are almost on the verge, very close really, to nuclear war. Closer than we thought, we find out later, right? Because the nuclear warheads were already there. But in this speech, he was trying to rehumanize the Soviets, to say, can we, is there a way to find some commonality so that we, can go forward? And he wanted to get this nuclear test ban treaty. But the only way to get that was to get people in the United States and Western allies who were a little nervous to say, let's get on board with this. We can coexist. Don't we? We all have children, right? We all breathe the same air. So I think that was, and again, it's a commencement speech, right? In a commencement speech, you can have, in any type of ceremonial speech, one of the things about it is that it's introspection, thinking, reflecting. And I guess all three of those, a eulogy, a commemoration, and a graduation commencement speech, they're getting us to think, and to think about things in new ways.
Looking towards the future, if you were advising a campaign and what their rhetoric might be
They
in the
wouldn't want me to
future.
advise. Get rid of her.
I mean, we talked about the importance of narrative and speech writing, and what are, to your mind, some things that might be timely and also effective towards, the kind of rhetoric that you're discussing, that it's more uplifting, rather?
Well, I think one thing that in order to be a successful presidential candidate and a successful presidential leader, you have to have a sense of vision. And I think that when that vision is an optimistic vision, it's more enduring. And so one of the parallels I really see between Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan is that they're different parties, right? They had very different policies in many ways, but they both had a very positive, uplifting perspective on what this country is and what it can accomplish when we work together. And it was inclusive. They weren't, saying, "Oh, you don't belong. You're not part of this group." And so I think that whatever the narrative is going to be, people have to be able to envision what their role in it is, and what are you for? What's going to happen if you're actually president? But now what we also have to make sure that we do too is that the smaller pieces that go out in social media reinforce that. And again, you have to kind of break it down, right? In some ways, what are the pieces that both of those campaigns and both of those administrations were very, very disciplined in terms of making sure that when they communicated, they were being consistent. Not to say they didn't have times when they messed up, because that's inevitable. You're human beings, but they were very, very consistent in what they sent out. And so I think that's important too.
Well, let's open it up to questions
Okay.
from the audience.
Sure.
If we've got any, if you all want to, we've got students with microphones. If you have a question, please raise your hand and the student will come to you. Friendly reminder, brief question, no filibustering. So, I know you have questions. Up here in the front, Olivia.
In considering ceremonial rhetoric, when a speechwriter has a president say something or do something, or like, pulling out someone in the audience for making a point, or saying something which is absolutely opposite of what he does. I know he's doing that to rally his base. But isn't he also chipping away at his own credibility and enforcing everybody else's opinion of him, and in therefore doing more harm than good?
Okay, so I get the sense that you might be talking about our current president from what you're saying. Okay, yeah, I mean, it is an issue, I think. But in terms of thinking about that State of the Union speech, right, which is, it's interesting, there are certain established forms, and yet different presidents put their marks on them. And Ronald Reagan, you know, the person in the gallery, and you said pointing out the different people. So President Trump had a lot more people, right? And in addition to that, I thought it was almost a combination, and this sounds really flip, but there is an element of it, but it was kind of a cross between State of the Union and Oprah Winfrey talk show. Because he had the different people in, but it wasn't just pointing them out, but it'd be like, look under your chair, you've got a scholarship, right there, you know, hey, your husband's here. Those are things that have not happened before. And your question about, does it undermine your credibility? Well, this goes back to another thing that has changed, I think, in contemporary times. And part of it has to do with our media landscape, but part of it just has to do, I don't know, with maybe other things. I can give you my speculation. But people do not know as much about civics as they once did, or about just basic issues or how things are. Annenberg Center for Public Policy in 2018 did a study, and they found that only 26% of the American population could name the 3 branches of government. I want you to think about that for a moment. 26% could name the 3 branches of government. And there's also this element, was it Dunning-Kruger? If you've heard this, where it's this phenomenon where the less you know, the more confident you are that you know. And so in one study, they gave a civics test to people, and 89% were highly confident that they had passed the test. And it turned out 83% of them had failed. All right? So we have a lot of that going on. So when you say, doesn't it chip away? For those who know, it does. It further chips away. But we're very polarized right now. So I think if there are people who know that this is in disagreement with what he said elsewhere, it reinforces that this guy cannot be trusted. But if you don't know what he's saying in these other venues, then you think, but he did this in that speech. And that's kind of where we are, I think.
Other questions? Don't be shy. There in the back.
I read an article recently about the software sophistication of being able to create your image that's not really you, kind of like a holograph, but three-dimensional and two-dimensional, but putting words in your mouth other than like Colbert does with just the lips moving, but actually making it so realistic that the observer, listener cannot differentiate without further information and context what the truth or veracity of what was just presented. I'd like you to comment on that and where that's going.
You are correct that there are folks out there who are creating, I don't know if you could hear what he said, they are creating videos where they can take a political figure and make it appear that they are saying something that they're not. And where is it going? Not in a good place, I imagine. I don't know, I mean, in terms of like, where are we now with that, or is it being used? I don't think so, or we might be in the very beginning stages and we probably won't know, for a while. But I think the thing about that would be most troubling is it's not going to be the campaigns that do it, but it's going to be maybe those who support a campaign, or, we've talked about other governments trying to intervene or other interests. That's where I think the danger is going to be with that. Yeah. That is scary. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. You talked about the decline of media, and it's somewhere in the neighborhood of the National Enquirer, and the extent that polarization has taken place, and you can look across various sources and have a sense that they're not in the same universe or on the same planet. So given that environment, how does anybody come forward with a message that's able to unite and reach a majority a supermajority, a cross-section of citizens. Is it possible anymore? Your thought about how that might be accomplished through communication and rhetoric?
Well, I think if people become disenchanted with what, if people become disenchanted with an incumbent, right? If enough, even people who maybe originally supported a person who's already in office, and they become disenchanted with that person because they're starting to see ripples in their own life in which policies are affecting them. Because sometimes it doesn't actually seem real until it affects you directly. But if those ripples start to affect one directly and you become disenchanted, then you might become more open to hearing what other voices have to say. I think also, too, that this is all we're talking about at the national level, and sometimes this polarization can sneak down to a local level, but we do have a lot more control there, right? In my own small hometown, which is at 25,000 people, we started a program at our college called Bridging Bell. Bell Avenue is this major avenue that goes through the college. And we get students to get together with community members, and we have meals and discussions and service projects. And I'm not saying that people need a program to do that, but what I am saying is that when people actually engage with others face to face, they realize that we have far more things in common, and that the other person may have a different political view, but they're not the demon that you have been led to believe, right? And one of the first people in my group was our mayor, who is Republican, and he said, the thing is, I don't have the luxury of not talking to the people in my town, because I go to the grocery store, and if somebody doesn't like something that I did, they're going to tell me, right? But I think that face-to-face contact, at least on a local level, is a really good way that we can stop that from continuing down, leaking down to where we are there.
Olivia, we had one up here, up at the front.
This one in the back.
All right, thanks. Okay, so the style of rhetoric that Donald Trump uses on social media is unique compared to what we've seen before from presidents. Do you see that same kind of style, in a way, manifesting in the other candidates for the presidency during this run?
I'm not seeing that in the other, if you're talking about the other, the Democratic candidates, I'm not seeing that there. I think that, I've had people ask me what will be Donald Trump's impact on the presidency, and I guess my answer would be, he is going to have an impact. He's broken so many norms, but we are not going to really know what his impact is until after he's gone, right? We do have some Republicans around the country in lower level positions who are running using the same type of language and techniques that he has used. So whether that kind of, peters out or whether that continues, I don't know. I don't know yet. People certainly are having to make use of social media. That's kind of a given. But I don't think we see the same kind of tone and language being used as he has.
We have one up here at the front that's been waiting.
Yeah.
Thank you. The Facebook, I want to go back to Facebook. Concerns that I have are what people have talked about is the influence that others can have and the targeting, because they have so much information about the people who use Facebook. As an ordinary consumer or citizen, how does one kind of get to the truth or discern the impact and be able to have an effect back in terms of when you go to vote? How much influence is Facebook? One of the other things is that Facebook is one of the few companies that decided not to pull ads. So I just would like your more comments on on that whole issue of Facebook. Thank you.
Sure. Well, one thing you can do, actually, that I know some people have done, is they've liked all the candidates. And so because of that, then your analytics get, you have to be willing then to have friends and relatives see that you liked a candidate that they find reprehensible. There is that, because it'll say, oh, they like, but that means that you kind of mess with their analytics a little bit, so you then are going to get messages that are not necessarily, would not typically be sent to you. So you can see those. And then I think the others are just the things that that I mentioned earlier in terms of trying to track out where did this story come from, dig beneath just the headline that is there, not responding maybe, not giving a like, or that, because when you do that, that lets them know you like that, and so you're more likely to get then further responses that are along those lines, or if you hated it or whatever.
Okay, here in the third row.
Thank you.
I've noticed the president will say something, and then Kellyanne Conway will come out with her alternative facts. We seem to see that more in this administration than we have perhaps in the past. What are we going to do?
What are we going to do? Well, I think that the best that one can do in terms of just as an individual, well, yes, I guess you could plug your ears too. You could, if you, but is to try to look at a broad, so that you can identify that they're not saying the same thing, right? Or that what she's saying is not the case. Or I mean, that's really all that you can do. And then eventually, it's you make your decision at the ballot box, right? It is helpful, I would say, to at least inform, like especially on crucial issues. But it sounds so cliche, but I think it does make a difference, and that is no matter who the person is, and no matter what party we're talking about, but is letting your senators or representatives know that you are distressed by X, Y, or Z, or that you support X, Y, and Z, even though there are times, and I know that's been true for me too, where you feel like they're not going to pay it, but they are counting. They're counting. And if they don't hear from anyone, they just assume that it's okay, right? So sometimes just to at least know that there are counter voices there. It takes a little bit of effort of writing an email or sending a postcard, or I've got my folks on speed dial now on my phone, right? But yeah, I think that's one thing we can do.
Earlier in your discussion, you talked about the constraint or the pressure on incumbent presidents that have promised a lot of change and like almost revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a change in rhetoric from the incumbent presidents or from the opposition that you've observed?
I couldn't quite catch the last.
Any change in rhetoric from like the incumbent or sitting president or the opposition to them during their reelection?
Oh, well, I think that once somebody is in office, if they're an incumbent, what you're going to get is you're trying to show how everything is much better than what it was. So, and how you have made progress and how you have fulfilled many of the promises. And so what you want to do is to vote for me so I can complete my agenda. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you're going to get from incumbents, I think. In terms of, I'm not quite sure at the end of that, we're saying, what kind of rhetoric do you hear from people opposing those who say change? Okay. So, some of it may be that they're inexperienced. You saw that with Barack Obama when he was first running. This guy's only been in the Senate for a few years. I mean, you're hearing that right now with Buttigieg, right? This guy's only been mayor of, how can he possibly be? And then the counters that they tend to give in response, which is, I think he's taking it right out of the Obama playbook, because he has a lot of the Obama people working for him too, which is, well, it's a matter of experience, or is it a matter of judgment, right? And so you point to the people who've been in office and the cases where they've made poor judgments. As an outsider, the one advantage that you often have is that you may not have, you don't have the track record. If you're a member of Congress, it is impossible not to vote for a bill that may at some point have things in it that you don't agree with. Politics is the art of compromise. That is what it is. And as the outsider, you can be more pure.
We have one up here.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much.
you.
This is another speculative question, so have fun with it, I guess. A lot of the discussion has been about like Facebook and Twitter, which are very public forums, and a lot of rhetoric research in general is about like public messages. But a lot of the newer social media are private, so thinking of like Snapchat or WhatsApp, that maybe they're not necessarily as popular here as they are in other countries, but have you thought much about how that might change if presidents start using those private channels, how that might change how they are communicating?
They actually all of the campaigns were on Snapchat last time. And so Snapchat has certain advantages, certain things that are not so great about it. So if you are on Snapchat, it's access through your phone. And so what that means is that if you're taking pictures, you can't edit everything very, all very pretty and so on. And so that means a lot of times the body person, in other words, the person who's with the candidate, they have to also double to take footage. And so they are on Snapchat, and they realize it can sometimes be useful to get people who are in your network to come to an event, but it's not hugely effective because its analytics are not particularly good. So for right now, they are on it because they feel like they should be, but it's really not all that helpful. A couple of them were using WhatsApp, but it's kind of the same thing. So I'm not sure yet, what's going to happen with that. These others are more popular, Facebook and Instagram, just because you can curate, to really edit, make everything look nice and make sure all your ducks are in a row. And then you also know you're going to get all this great information from Facebook if you pay for it. And in addition to that, if you get somebody who agrees, you can send out all those messages, whereas, and in Snapchat too, things disappear after 24 hours, right? So that's not quite as appealing for a campaign either.
And time for one more.
Do you know why people are less civil when they're on their phones rather than their home computers?
I'm speculating, all right? I think it's social media in general. It's easier to be rude to other people because you're not with them, right? And Twitter, it is easier to do that because on Twitter, you don't get to approve the people who follow you, right, who are following your account and who can respond to what you say, whereas in Facebook, you have to approve who your friends are. Does that make sense? So you may be responding on Twitter to people you don't know, so more often. So you don't feel the need to be civil. But I think in terms of, back to your question, why the phone, maybe it's just something, I don't know, but maybe it's just something that when you're at your computer, you think about other sorts of things that you do at your computer. They demand thoughtfulness, right? You're writing a letter, you are working on an account or something that you have to think. When you're on your phone, it's like, right? And so it's impulsive. And maybe it's just that. That's my guess.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Bostdorff for being here.
Thank you so much. It was really a lot of fun.
Barbara?
I don't know if we have the mic on or not, but I do want to thank you all very much for coming for the series and spending your time, and I hope it was not only entertaining, but very factual, and you learned a lot. But I also want to thank our Associate Director, Audrey Coleman, and I want you to give her